Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reform GGA, and today I'm going to give you guys a hopefully brief update on the status of my traveling bedside gun. For those of you who have not been following the channel, for a while I was using a KS-47 by Palmetto State Armory. It was one of the 10.5-inch barreled versions, so a pistol version, and there was a lot to like about the gun in general. It was basically an AR design that was modified to shoot 7.62 by 39. And so one of the things that I liked about it is that it shot relatively cheap ammunition that I already had in hand for other guns. So cheap ammunition was definitely a bonus, and because it was only a 10.5-inch version, it was small enough to fit in my traveling bedside gun case. That was lockable, TSA approved, all those good things. And so it fit in my traveling case, which is a good thing. Cheap ammunition, it's a good thing. Also, since it was 7.62 by 39, even though it was in a 10.5-inch barrel, which is not going to be as potent as a longer barrel, but even at that, it was still a very powerful round compared to guns that I'd used previously. Well over 1,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, so it's pretty powerful. Most of what I was using before would have basically been classified, and a lot of it was, handgun rounds. So a rifle round, an intermediate rifle round out of a short barrel, true, but still a rifle round compared to most of your common handgun rounds, there's a very significant difference there in terms of power. So it was a lot more powerful. Also, the ballistic coefficient on 7.62 by 39, while it's not the greatest ballistic coefficient in the world, it is usually better than most handgun rounds, and so its ability to be used at greater ranges is of course far better than with most handguns. So it met the size and weight requirements, good. Cheap ammunition, good. More powerful, good. Had better range capabilities. All of those things are good. Very good reasons to like the gun in that particular role. However, as I started testing it and also started using it as a traveling bedside gun, there were some deficiencies that showed up for my particular application and the kinds of things that I was trying to do with it, and particularly the kinds of ammunition I was trying to use with it. Two major issues wound up coming to the forefront. The one is that in the course of testing it, it proved not to be a completely reliable design. Within 500 rounds, it was like 485 if you want to get particular about it, but in less than 500 rounds, I managed to break the extractor. And that's a fairly hard breakage. Not that it takes a gun 100% out of the fight, but not having an extractor on a gun can induce some pretty nasty malfunctions that, while not technically completely deactivating, does not completely deactivate the gun, your odds of being able to get through a life and death encounter with a gun that does not have a functioning extractor goes down pretty dramatically. Like I said, it's not complete game ender, but very nearly so. Functionally, I would say so. And now that is a replaceable part, and I did replace it, and I replaced it with a stronger one, and I haven't had any problems since, but I also haven't put a ton of rounds through it since, so you have to bear that in mind. But in investigating why that happened, I found out that the gun was wildly overgassed, and I put a heavier buffer in the gun to help mitigate that, but it's still wildly overgassed. There's a lot of just excess power in that gun that stresses and strains everything that's in there, and without a very significant overhaul of the gun, especially putting in an adjustable gas block would be the main thing that it would need. Without doing that, the gun is basically going to beat itself apart. And because of that, I wasn't super confident in its reliability, at least not without making those changes, and I didn't really feel like making those changes. So reliability was definitely an issue. The other issue is just kind of the nature of a bedside self-defense gun, especially as it relates to the traveling aspect. It's my traveling bedside gun. And when I travel, I of course oftentimes stay in hotel rooms like this one, and hotel rooms are actually a lot like a lot of residential rooms, in that the primary thing that usually separates one room from the next is basically just a couple of layers of drywall and sometimes insulation. And drywall and insulation do not offer much resistance to bullets. And there have been various studies that have been done, and various, kind of backyard science experiments where people have tested and see just how much drywall will a typical full metal jacket bullet go through, how much insulation can a typical full metal jacket bolt go through, and the answer is always way too much. A lot of full metal jacket rounds, like say 9mm and 5.56 for example, so 9mm full metal jacket rounds and 5.56 by 45 full metal jacket rounds can oftentimes make it through roughly 20 or so layers of drywall. And given that most walls have one layer of drywall on one side and one on the other, that would mean somewhere around 10 walls worth. And people would say, well, if you have insulation between those walls, that'll cut it down. And that's true to a certain extent. But insulation actually doesn't offer much bullet resistance either. People have, again, kind of done the backyard science thing, where they've taken the big industrial bundles of insulation, set them down, and shot fairly low power rounds to them, like 25 ACP, which is about as low powered as you can get in a center fire cartridge, and found that even something as weak as that was still able to get through the entire bundle of insulation. And of course, a wall is not going to have anywhere near that kind of insulation. It's still going to go through. So it's safe to assume that most rounds that are going to be capable of stopping a threat are probably also going to be powerful enough, at least in full metal jacket form, to get through, say, 5 to 10 walls, whether it be interior residential walls or it be the kind of walls that you have between hotel rooms. That's not a good thing when you think about it. That is a problem that's an situation that tends to lead to the problem of what is called overpenetration. What a lot of people think of as overpenetration is more or less when you hit something that you didn't intend to hit. So you're trying to stop the threat, and in the process of stopping the threat, you wind up, firing in either a stray direction or even hitting the intended target, and the bullet goes through the intended target. And in either case, you wind up hitting something, or particularly someone, that you didn't intend to hit. Now, and that's a huge problem when you're talking about an environment that isn't very bullet resistant. You're talking mostly about drywall and insulation. And a lot of these hotel rooms, not so much on the insulation, but still not very bullet resistant at all. And if you're going to be firing bullets in that environment, the possibility of hitting something that you didn't intend to hit or someone that you didn't intend to hit becomes a very real concern. And there are two basic ways to try to mitigate the risk associated with that concern of so-called overpenetration. The first and most important is hit what you aim at. Hit the intended target. Most of the cases where people wound up getting hit who shouldn't have been hit, it's been cases where the intended target was missed. The shot went wild, left, right, up, down, whatever the case happens to be. The person who was firing the shot missed their target completely and wound up sending the round, instead of into the target, they sent it into the wall and basically into the guy in the next room, and that's really not a good thing. So the first rule is hit what you aim at, and having a gun that's more accurate is going to help with that. And that's why for my bedside guns I usually pick something that has a third point of contact, something beyond a typical handgun, because you're going to be much more accurate that way. And the KS-47 definitely did fit that bill. I was fairly accurate with it, even under stress and those kinds of things. Much more accurate with a gun like that than I would be with any handgun, and that's true for pretty much anyone. Most people are much more accurate, especially under stress, with a long gun compared to a conventional handgun. That's pretty well established. So for your bedside gun, pick something that you're going to be accurate with. Especially to mitigate the overpenetration issue. And then the second way that you mitigate overpenetration is you pick particular rounds that are not likely to get through the intended target with a whole lot of energy left over. That is, they're going to dump most of their energy in the target instead of carrying straight through the target, and then you get problems with whatever happens to be behind the target. So you want them to dump their energy in the target. And this means generally using some kind of defensive load. So for handguns, that usually means some kind of hollow points, and for rifles, it usually means using some kind of soft point or something along that same vein. In the case of my KS-47, I opted for soft points because they're relatively inexpensive and also extremely effective for the intended use. A lot of the soft points that I was using would stop at somewhere around the 15-inch mark in ballistic gelatin. There's been several tests that have been done out there. Again, some of it kind of backyard stuff, but some of it fairly legit, where people have shot at ballistics gelatin and seen, lo and behold, that they usually do stop somewhere around 15 inches with these 7.62 by 39 soft points that are also relatively inexpensive. Most of them I could find for 40 cents a round or less, which is a fantastic price for a defensive round. And like I said, very effective in terms of stopping when they need to. The accepted standard in ballistics gelatin is that it needs to stop somewhere between the 12-inch mark and the 18-inch mark. That's the FBI standard, and that's a fairly good usable standard. So it stops fairly quickly. It dumps a massive amount of energy. Even though it was out of a short barrel, it still dumps a massive amount of energy compared to any handgun round. All of that is well and good, except in application, because it's a traveling bedside gun and it doesn't get used during the day. I have a carry gun for daytime use. It only gets brought out at night. It only gets loaded at night, and so it gets unloaded in the morning, basically. So it gets loaded and unloaded basically once every 24 hours. And that is turned out to be really hard on those soft point rounds in that particular gun. The KS-47, like I said, is an AR type design, and like all AR type guns, or pretty much all AR type guns, it has an automatic ejector. There's a little plunger on the bolt face. You have the bolt, and there's a little plunger on one side that has constant pressure on the back of the casing that's always trying to push it out. Now, if the whole bolt is forward, the chamber is going to prevent that plunger from doing anything because it's going to push against the wall of the chamber and it's not going to go anywhere. But as soon as you pull back on that bolt, it's going to try to push that round out of the ejection port as soon as you get it pulled far enough back. Well, with the soft point rounds, that soft tip would usually get caught on the locking lugs as it was being pulled out, because there would be that constant pressure trying to kick it out, and it would drag against the locking lugs, and the end of that bullet would get chewed up pretty quickly. Load it and extract it just a couple of times and the tip of the bullet would be ruined, and of course it's not going to fly straight or even function properly at that point anymore. So in order to mitigate that, I would wind up putting a full metal jacket round on top of the magazine. I'd still have soft points underneath, but the first round that I would load and unload all the time would be a full metal jacket round. Well, the problem with that is that you completely undo the reason for using proper defensive ammunition. You're trying to mitigate the problem of over-penetration by having most of the energy dump in the target. If you use a full metal jacket round, full metal jacket rounds will dump some energy in the target, but a lot of it gets carried through to whatever is behind the target, and that's not good, especially in an environment like this. So ultimately, the KS-47 I felt personally was too unreliable for that particular task, and it chewed up the ammunition that I wanted to use that served the intended purpose of mitigating over-penetration potential. So I wound up going back to kind of an old standby that I've used in the past, and now I've come back to because it hits all the right boxes. And that is this little guy right here. This is my CZ Scorpion Evo 3 S1 pistol with brace. As you can see, I have loaded in it a 50-round extended magazine from Palmetto State Armory. Have a very simple red dot scope on there. On the other side, I have the PL Pro Valkyrie weapons light. It's a very simple system, but it is astoundingly reliable. There are some issues with CZ Scorpions that I've talked about in the past that can produce unreliability, certain kinds of ammunition in particular, and also certain methods of fire that can create problems, like really significant problems with like out of battery detonations and things like that. But those are all mitigatable, and as long as you know about them, and I have another video that talks about them if you're curious about that, it's a very reliable system. Now granted, it's only 9mm, so it's not nearly as powerful as the KS-47 was, and it's pistol rounds, so the ballistic coefficient is also not nearly as good as the 7.62 by 39 rounds were, but I can load and unload it basically indefinitely without having to worry about significant problems with the ammunition. And there are ways that you could do that would be a lot worse. If you conventionally load it by just sticking in the magazine, pull back on the charging handle and let it go, which is kind of a standard way of charging it, you can wind up pushing the bullet back in the casing a little bit, which can create an overpressure situation. What I do is I usually just lock the bolt back, drop the round in place, and then lower the bolts a little bit, and then just drop it for the last bit so that it doesn't hit with too much force, and you don't have to worry about the bullet set back with that. And you can do that a ton of times with most defensive ammunition that's nickel plated, which is going to be a little bit more resistant, and you can get your rounds to last a lot longer doing that. And it also is one of the relatively few kind of pistol caliber carbine type guns. It's not technically a true carbine in the legal sense. Legally it's a pistol, but it kind of fits that form factor of a pistol caliber carbine. And a lot of pistol caliber carbines don't do great with hollow points, but both of my CZ Scorpions actually do just fine with pretty much every hollow point that I've ever put in them, so that works. So it is a more reliable system. It doesn't chew up my defensive ammunition. I can use ammunition that's actually intended for this kind of environment to help mitigate over penetration and all that. So that's where I'm at. Yes, I would still prefer something that is more powerful, that has a better effective range, etc., etc. But as far as my price point, where my budget is, the CZ Scorpion that I just showed you is what is filling all the boxes right now. I'm not saying that there aren't, SBR type guns or rifle caliber pistols that are out there that couldn't fill that niche. It's just that within my budget, it doesn't seem that there's a whole lot of good guns that are like that. Rifle caliber guns, oftentimes being gas operated, if the quality level is too low, you can wind up with some significant reliability issues and whatnot. And depending on what your budget is, it might be better to go to a different operating system like the CZ Scorpion that's blowback, that's a lot simpler and a lot easier to get right and a lot easier to make it reliable, because they usually are very reliable right out of the box. It's usually not a big issue at all. Okay, so that's where I am. Got a little bit longer than I thought it would, but I guess it is what it is. Hopefully it gives you guys some things to think about, and also some cost-benefit kind of analysis in terms of pros versus cons. What are you getting versus what you're giving up? In my case, I gave up power and range in order to gain reliability and mitigation of over-penetration. That was the offset for me, and that's what I thought would be, that's what I decided was a fair trade for my situation, given the guns that I have at my disposal that are within my budget. That's where I'm at. Thank you for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you will come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.